Digress. I'd like to thank you for having me today. My family has 3 generations of Rotarians, but I haven't lived anywhere in one place since 1988. So hopefully now in San Miguel I get to join you and I can start being a contributing member of society and help out a little bit. So thank you very much for having me. I understand the brevity of today, and so I'm going to keep it light. I'm going to cut out a lot of statistics and things I was going to do and just have a happy talk rather than a lecture or a speech. I've entitled the speech, A Musician's Life, an Abnormal Existence of Adversity, Poverty, and Absolute and Utter Contentment. It's true, a musician is the only person in the world who will take $5,000 worth of gear, put it into a $500 car, drive 50 miles to make $80. You have the 1% in regular society. Musicians have the 0.00001%, and that is the distinction between, say, a guy who plays in a little nightclub for $30 and Justin Bieber. For every Justin Bieber, there's 20,000 people like that. In the world of music, someone who has a tenure at a university or performs in a philharmonic or a symphony, they represent less than 1% of professional working musicians. Another 1% you could find on cruise ships or in the hotel circuit around the world, which I did for 8 years. And you'd have to ask yourself, what would make somebody choose this life? And the answer is very simple. I've performed with musicians from over 60 countries, and it's because from a very early age they have a different set of core values. It's not the house, the career, it's the pursuit of perfection of their craft. And it is something in this society where musicians aren't always recognized for that. We live in a society, when we do a fundraiser, quite often the only person who's volunteering their time aside from the volunteers is the musicians. Will perform for free. But when, for instance, if you're doing a fundraiser for a hospital, to build a new wing of a hospital, the plumbers, the carpenters, the architects, none of them would give their time for free. But musicians do it because they love what they do. It is not who they are, it is what they are. So we'll start with that. I mean, I have friends like Big Ru Jake in Toronto, Canada, who's been sleeping on a futon. He's 48 years old. Since the 1980s, he's never had his own vacation. Then I have other friends like Michael Bublé. The last time I saw him, he invited me on his G5 to go to New York for a steak at his favorite steak restaurant. So the diversity is pretty extreme. Now, I'll just start very briefly with how I started. When I was a kid, I grew up in Newfoundland, St. John's, Newfoundland. I mean, you've got 15 or 20 feet of snow outside. You've got a lot of time to kill indoors. So my grandparents had an old record player that I learned to use at the age of 3. And inside that record player was Count Basie, Glenn Miller, Guy Lombardo and his Royal Canadians, Bessie Smith, Cab Calloway, Frank Sinatra, Bobby Darin, and all these albums became sort of my life. So luckily by the time I was 10, I knew the words to about 1,000 songs. And believe me, you're not that cool at school if you know the words to Red Roses for a Blue Lady. They just don't get it. And that's how it started for me. My grandparents' house. It's the only music I knew. So by the time I got to school and the other kids were listening to rock and roll, I was like, what the hell is that racket? I had no idea what that is. By the age of 5, I learned how to use my parents' record player, and I went through an unfortunate phase of my life where 3, 4 o'clock in the morning I would wake up, I would go out to the record player, put on my favorite album at the time, which was Elvis Gold, put it on, plug in the headphones, and be dancing in the living room at 4 o'clock in the morning. Unfortunately, every time it got to the crescendo of Kentucky Rain, I would be dancing so much that the headphones would pull out, and the house would go nuts with the sound of Elvis. Mom and Dad would jump up. I'd go to bed with a sore ass, but I'd do it again 2 days later. And that's for me where it began. My mother, my biological father was a singer, who I never met until I was 30 years old. I never met him. He was out of the picture. So music in my house was something that nobody wanted for me, or for anybody in the family. You know, my father wanted me to be a doctor or a lawyer like you, Tony. You know, someone who wears a suit, carries a briefcase, a scope and influence, uses fax machines, gets to drive new cars. So it was something that nobody ever really wants, because the struggle and the diversity of what you're trying to do, it's really, really, really long shots. I mean, you can go and get an education as an architect or a dentist, and if you study hard and apply yourself and you work diligently, you can succeed. In music, it's really a lot of luck, natural talent, right time, right place, but it literally is 0.0001%. So I left home at 17 years of age. I was never encouraged to be musical. I had a soprano voice when I was a kid, sang in the cathedral in St. John's, Newfoundland, but never encouraged to be musical. But I realized at a young age, academia wasn't for me. There wasn't anything I wanted my parents to spend the money on for me to go to university, to get an education and follow the normal concept of meet someone, get married, get a nice house, work my way up the structure, and just apply myself to that. I always felt restless, like there was something else out there for me. So I left home at 17 and I just traveled. I lived in the Rocky Mountains. I worked at Jasper Park Lodge. I was a semi-precious metal engineer, which is pot washer in the kitchen. We had ceramic engineers. Then when I turned 18, I was old enough to be in the dining rooms. I went into the Beauvais dining room, worked my way up, and eventually I delivered room service on a bicycle in the Rocky Mountains and saw elk and everything every day, but I still felt restless, even though I was traveling and doing all these things I wanted. I went to Jamaica. I lived in Jamaica for a while. I worked for a reggae artist, just sort of moving stuff around, and that was the first time I was around the music industry. Came back to Canada. I ended up in the north in small Inuit towns, northern Quebec and the Northwest Territories, towns like catchy towns, Kanjik-Sujuak, Sanakiluak, Pavungituk. Anybody? No. Okay. Well, it was quite an experience, and it was up there that I first saw a CD. And because when I was a kid, I mean, I don't know if anyone else here, music was such a revelation for me. And when I got old enough, I started working when I was 8 or 9 doing paper routes. So I always had my own money. And it was almost a mystical journey for me to go to a record store. I would get on a bus or get on my bicycle and go, who here had 78s? 45s. Anybody? Do I have anybody back? 45. 45s for me. Do we have anybody back? And it was, for me. Even I had a friend named Jeff Healy. I don't know if anyone ever heard of him, the blind guitar player, played the blues. He was in Roadhouse with Patrick Swayze. Jeff died a few years ago, but he died extraordinarily poor because his money had been taken from him by his manager, who also happened to be the drummer. But he didn't care because he had the largest 78 collection in history. And he taught me so much. If you listen to old albums like Jack Pepper or Al Jolson, you'll notice there are no drums on early recordings because he used to record under hot wax. And when the drums would start up, the needle would skip out. So that's why when you hear, I'm happy, so happy, there's no drums. And so the obsession with music and with albums for me, I would go and buy a 45. That I would travel, because you don't really, when you think like a musician, you're kind of an idiot. Because you're like, I'm going to take my money, I'm going to travel 2.5 hours on the bus each way to buy a $2.50 45 album, and I'm going to come back home and spend the rest of Sunday afternoon listening to this over and over and over and over and over again. That's why my friends who have, summer homes and cottages and go away on vacations to Italy every year, they spent that Sunday afternoon studying or out playing baseball or doing things like that. So the whole idea of music for me was a lot different. For most people, it's I enjoy this album and I'll go up and dance this song. I love Elvis. In the early days of music, everything has changed dramatically in the past 13 years. Up until 1999, you went to a record store and you bought an album. Today, if you go to a record store and you buy an album, you're holding an album in your hand or a CD, that album represents 1,000. So for that one album, there's 999 examples of that album or songs from that album that are now done online. Because the new generation doesn't buy albums. They download everything on their iPods, their iPhones. Thank you, Sunday, for telling me the terminology for this technology. I still carry quarters in my pocket for payphones. So the music industry has completely changed, but a very brief idea of the way it used to be with radio stations like Sun Records. Anyone remember Sun Records? Elvis Presley. Chess Records, Etta James, Howlin' Wolf, Big Joe Turner. These little record companies used to record an artist, press the album, and then they would have guys that would go on the road to all the radio stations across America and ride DJs Here's a bottle of scotch, here's some money, play this album. Many of the songs that are classics today that you know came about by someone bribing a DJ to put it on the radio. Today, there's over 14,000 radio stations in America. And the important thing about America is for Canadians, for British artists, I mean the Beatles, breaking the US is the only way to make it. You need to break into the US market. The US market is the market for music these days. Well, has been since the beginning. So these 14,000 radio stations now are dictated by a group of guys who actually were car dealership owners. So you will see a playlist today on the top 40 radio station of less than 40 songs. And it's a formula now. It's completely different. Everything has changed. You can't break into the industry now like you could even 15 or 20 years ago. You could never have a Billy Joel or an Elton John today. They would rather have a Justin Bieber or a, who's the girl who's all over the place? She used to be so sweet on Disney. Miley Cyrus. And what's her stage name? Hannah Montana. I should know that. Sunday has all the CDs. So everything is different now. So just to back up, when I finally hit the world of music, I was living in Ottawa, Ontario, and I started singing with a fellow named Johnny Vegas. I then moved to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and I was a weird kid. I wore suits to school, I wore fedoras, I carried a briefcase. My favorite guy was Judge Harry Stone on Night Court because he loved Mel Torme, and I was that weird kid at school dances who would go up to the DJ and request, you know, hey man, could you play Dream Lover by Bobby Darin? And they didn't know what I was talking about. Halifax, Nova Scotia, I decided that I wanted to create a night in a club where I would like to go out for a date, who I would ask me for a dance. Emily Post, social dancing, double jive, single jive, Lindy Hop, social waltz, social foxtrot. So I met these guys and we started a swing orchestra in 1996 in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Our very first show, we were packed onto a stage much smaller than this, and we played to two girls in cocktail dresses who stole my heart. It's okay. The next week, we had a lineup outside the bar for an hour and a half, because my generation at that time, I was in my 20s, was looking for something different. Little did we know that at the same time, in America, specifically in Los Angeles and San Francisco and New York, a revival was happening. And we didn't know until a movie came out called Swingers, which was Vince Vaughn and Jon Favreau. It was Vince Vaughn's first movie about this new generation of people who like to dress up, shave with a straight razor, wear triple soap robes, you know, and the girls would wear polka dot dresses. It's just sort of a return to the way things were. And this revival sort of took my orchestra and I, washed us up into this big tidal wave and just hurtled us forward. So within 8 months of starting, we were standing on stage in Halifax, Nova Scotia, winning our first East Coast Music Award. We signed a record deal with Universal Music. It was fantastic. It was all a whirlwind. We got rushed off to Montreal, Canada to record at a place called Morin Heights in the studio. The day we arrived there, Celine Dion was leaving. We got in there. We live on a lake in a private house. They clean for you. We were all just kids going from playing on a stage for 30, 40 bucks a night. I worked as a waiter, and I would pay money out of my pocket to the better players to keep everyone playing. It was a labor of love. So when we finally got into the recording studio, we just couldn't believe it. They had to keep restocking the pop machine because my guys, who were average of 18 to 22 years of age, all came from the Halifax University of Music, couldn't get over the fact you could just press the button and a soda pop would pop out without putting money in. They didn't realize that the record industry was charging us $2 a can on the back end of our album sales. That's okay. I took over Celine Dion's dressing room because I found it first and I closed the door. Nobody else knew about it until I'd been in there for days with all the cheese and champagne and everything left behind. My drummer was outside and he looked through the windows. The place was huge. And he saw me in there lying on the couch with a glass of champagne, and he started beating on the door. I let him in and I said, okay, but don't tell the other guys, okay? Of course, 20 minutes later, there's 13 people in there going to the fridge, eating all the cheese. We released the album. It was produced by a fellow named Nick Kane from a country band called the Mavericks. And we made a music video, and we hit the road. Our very first show was part of a tour called Somersault. I don't know if you know any of these bands, but it was Garbage, Our Lady Peace, Crystal Method, I Mother Earth, but swing was hot. So we were on stage, a swing orchestra in matching suits, a 9-piece horn section playing for 25, 30,000 kids who were mosh pitting. We weren't everybody's cup of tea, but we learned early on in the tour that if we filled up water pistols with vodka and squirted it into the crowd, we could win them over. I'm sorry, but you've got to realize, we are not thinking like your average corporate or an educated person. Put vodka in a water pistol, squirt it at someone, they will like you. I know this would work at a board meeting. Or maybe it would, I don't know. I've never been to a board meeting. So we hit the road that day. That was our very first show. And for the next 6 years, I did 320 to 330 shows a year. Anyone from Boston. The Roxy in Boston, the Supper Club in New York City, the Derby in LA, the Valor Ballroom in Des Moines, the Red Room Supper Club in New Orleans. And we just toured nonstop. We were a 13-piece orchestra. We had to stay on the road in order to survive. It was shark swimming, 13 people plus a tour manager and a sound man. To keep alive, we had to just play night after night after night after night. I never slept in the same bed twice, more than once a year. It was a different bed every night, and sometimes on a tour bus, 12-month tour bus, and you were constantly moving and evolving. It was over these years, because we would do everything from shows for some kids in a nightclub in the Blind Pig in Michigan, where the university is. And then the next night we do a corporate show for IBM. It was just constant moving. We'd play in Austin, Texas, and then we drive all night to play in Dallas. Just constantly moving. It was while we were on the road that I discovered that we went certified gold. So 50,000 albums at $24.99 in an HMV. I immediately started looking at cars, and I was thinking, this is going to be incredible. I'm going to be rich for the first time in my life. I'm going to get my mom this and this and that. And then this is where the whole thing comes in for the way it's constructed for musicians. I found out that $24.99 times 50,000 albums doesn't actually go to the artist. You're paid a royalty rate of $1.70. So I was supposed to get 50,000 times $1.70. I thought, well, that's pretty good. But then I found out the money they invested in our album, I paid them back at $1.70 an album. So I owed them $800,000 at this point for the recording, for the tour support, for the music videos. So I actually still owed them about $650,000. But you never pay it back, and that's how the record industry keeps artists into this sort of this void, where they just constantly have to go on the road and provide the albums. And the interesting thing is, I was the last generation of musicians to sign a deal in 1998 that was essentially the same deal you would have signed in 1965 or 1960. The fellows who changed the industry were people like Frank Sinatra, who actually had clout and power. And then in the 80s, people like Madonna. And there's always been a precedent set by an artist. The artist formerly known as Prince, who's Prince again, was the very first artist to cut completely from the record industry and go their own way, and not only survive, but thrive. Because the music industry is absolutely archaic, and they haven't been able to keep up with the way things have changed. My album, I released an album in 2001, my first solo album, and it was kind of a hit. Anyone from Canada? Don't be ashamed. They're like, we had 3 top 10 hits in Canada off this one album, but nobody was buying the albums because there was a thing called Napster, which the record company wouldn't recognize. Even though the album was downloaded tens of thousands of times, as far as the record company was concerned, nobody was buying the album, so there was no principal coming in, so they considered it a failure. Even though the young guys in the corporation, who are now in charge, were like, no, you don't understand. The album's not selling because we're not doing anything about people downloading these albums. So essentially, Napster is the thing that in 2001 ended up putting me in Singapore singing at the Raffles Hotel. Raffles Hotel is lovely, it's gorgeous, it's beautiful, but I'm singing in a hotel, and then I went to cruise ships. So 8 years I lived in Portugal, singing on cruise ships, experiencing the world musically especially, playing with people from Poland, classically trained Russian artists, Italian artists. It's unbelievable the amount of talent you can find on cruise ships, because there are musicians from all over the world. I lived in Greece for a year when I was younger. I don't care if you're a bouzouki player from Greece, or you're a violinist from Vienna, or you're a mariachi player. You're in San Miguel de Allende. I should tell you, I don't have my glasses, so I can't see a thing. I actually can't tell if there's anybody in the room right now. I could be speaking to a bunch of seats and I wouldn't know. So my shift in focus went from being on TV and on the radio and rubbing elbows. I got to be schooled in the 1990s by Oscar Peterson, Leonard Cohen. I got to spend time with Shania Twain, who was a big fan of the swing orchestra. And every night was a giant adventure, which is why I'm 44 years old now, but I might as well be 17, because I've never, maybe it's Peter Pan, but if you follow your bliss, which is what I've done, you're gonna be happy, for sure. Not everyone is gonna be happy for you. All these years on cruise ships and in hotels was an experience to expand and to learn more. And more about me, to be really honest, that I never really cared about the norm. I never had core values like my father or my friends. What was most important to me was the pursuit of musical perfection, which is impossible to achieve. Tony Bennett once told me, the more you learn about music, the more you learn about nothing. And he is getting better as he gets older. He's in his 80s now, and his onset, his structure, his phrasing, is just absolutely magnificent. Some of the greatest musicians that I admire, Billie Holiday, Nat King Cole, Etta James, Nina Simone, Dinah Shore down in Washington, their phrasing really captivated and changed everything. You could take Miley Cyrus and Justin Bieber and thread it all the way back to Bing Crosby, Ella Fitzgerald, and Louis Armstrong. They're the three people who actually changed the way people sang, more phrasing. You remember in the 20s, well, I don't think anybody here remembers the 20s, but the style of music in the 20s was a sort of, I'm happy, so happy. The phrasing and the onsets was changed by those three people specifically. And I know you're Googling everything I'm saying right now. How am I doing? Yes? Okay, please Google. So, just to wrap it up, essentially, what I'm saying is all those years on cruise ships, and now my discovery of San Miguel, I'm really glossing over a lot of stuff that happened over the years, was that I found in this city, I found a contentment and an ability to really reflect with myself and think about, you know, sometimes it's tough to be honest with yourself and saying to yourself, you know, could I have done this, should I have done that? But I found in this city an honesty with myself that I wouldn't have been able to do this talk 8 months ago, 10 months ago, because I wasn't able to admit my failings and where my life is at now. I'm singing in a little bar in Masoni's. Sometimes I sing at the Hotel Nina, sometimes I'll sing at weddings. But I am happier now than I've ever been in my life, even when I was on TV and I was rubbing elbows with the rich and famous, because the core value for me, and I know I speak for the majority of professional musicians, is not accolades, it's not money, it's not wealth, it's where you're at with your music in terms of integrity with your music, and in terms of, are you pushing yourself, are you pushing forward musically? Now in my family, I told you that they didn't want me to be a singer, they didn't want to be a musician. Unfortunately, my cousins and my family growing up seeing me on television all the time. Now my cousin Eric is a lead singer and guitar player in a heavy metal band, which now I understand when he was 4 and he got big deal, when I get older I'm gonna do what you do, but different. I'm like, what do you mean by different? He's like, I don't know, different. He's a musician. My cousin Jackie is in a school in Montreal doing musical theater. She's a musician. My cousin Ian in Vancouver is an actor. Unfortunately, I sort of opened the floodgates, so the entire family's worried when I'm gone, the rest of us kids are going to be living on the street and busking. But there you go, folks. That's the whole point that I'm just trying to convey is for musicians, yes.
Johnny, I wanted to thank you for sharing your life with us, number one. Number two, I've enjoyed your performances since I have been in San Miguel. Number three, your restaurant makes the best margaritas I've ever had.
Thank you. We're all welcome for margaritas, ladies and gentlemen.